This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We are rolling right along with what we are calling hangers-on week. It is traditionally this period in an election calendar, an election cycle, where the field is thinning, as they say, but there are still a bunch of candidates hanging on for one reason or another. So we're looking at why those candidates hang on, who some of the most notable ones have been in the past, and the reasons that they hang on, and those candidates are actually really interesting and teach us a lot about American elections and American politics and changing American eras. That is definitely the case for today's subject, Jesse Jackson, activist, preacher, and former associate of Dr. Martin Luther King. And by the mid to late 80s, he is trying his hand at Democratic Party politics and making a compelling case as he builds his so-called Rainbow Coalition. So, please welcome to the hangers-on stage, Jesse Jackson, Democratic candidate in 1984 and 1988. I guess failed Democratic candidate, if you want to call that, clearly unsuccessful, but very influential in interesting ways. Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Have you eased into hangers-on week? Are you feeling like we got a little rhythm here? You know,
we are hanging in on hangers-on.
Exactly. Yeah, maybe some listeners will be like, oh, this is going on a little too long, and that's the point. We're trying to
meta
give you that
commentary, people.
Wrap it up.
So, Jesse Jackson, we've touched on him before. I think we've touched on that 1988 election a number of times. Very interesting character. And we'll get to the kind of like what he does when we look at him in this light of as a hanger-on, right? A sort of primary politics figure. But let's paint a sketch of who he is, especially into the 80s. I mean, we could go through his civil rights activism CV, but it feels like there's two kind of relationships that Jesse Jackson is navigating at this moment, which collide in this moment. So one is with the civil rights community, his roots of activism, and the folks he sort of came up with in the 60s and 70s. And then there's the Democratic establishment party politics. And he's sort of right now going into the overlap between the two. So let's start with the first one. I mean, what is sort of Jesse Jackson's place in the civil rights community, if you want to call it that, in the 80s in particular?
I mean, I'm going to say something that probably sounds a little mean, but he's kind of a hangers-on, too, in the civil rights movement. Like, I mean, I think people, obviously, for many reasons, people saw Martin Luther King Jr. as the, pinnacle leader of the civil rights movement. And I think in a lot of ways, Jesse Jackson tried to pick up that mantle, and no one wanted him to take it up. And so I think he's constantly trying to sort of center himself as this new leadership that will keep the movement going. And time and time again, other key members of the Civil Rights Movement Party are like, dude, no, we don't respect you.
There's also this other piece of his activism that is defined by a lot of these tensions, which is after King's assassination, Jackson is still active in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he's in charge of this thing called Operation Breadbasket, which is focused on kind of the economic side of Black civil rights. And he's going to continue to pursue that economically focused politics in the 1970s. He ends up breaking with SCLC because, again, there are a lot of personal problems that he has with other movement leaders. But that becomes important as we talk about his run in 1984 and 1988, because that idea of economic equality and Black civil rights going hand in hand has been at the forefront of Jackson's activism since the late 1960s.
And I will say, in some ways, it does pick up on King's work. I mean, King's last movement was the Poor People's Campaign. And so sort of moving away from race into class is what a lot of social and political leaders start to take up.
Yeah. I mean, Kellie, you sort of, I think, are hinting at it. But I mean, was there also just some personal animus there? I mean, and just he's clearly an over the top figure for good and bad, right? And so I would imagine that maybe he ruffled feathers, or what's.
I mean, it's well documented that like after King was assassinated, Jesse Jackson sort of wears his bloodstained clothes for almost a week and kind of refuses to take them off and does like interviews while wearing those bloodstained clothes, and that puts a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. A lot of people saw him as an opportunist, and so people like Andrew Young, Coretta, they're not huge fans of Jesse Jackson.
Yeah. There's also and we'll get to this, as we start to transition to kind of his role within Democratic politics and party establishment politics, but there's also a kind of reticence, I would say, from some of those people you mentioned, like Andrew Young, mayor of Atlanta, Coretta Scott King, to embrace his runs, because I think there was this calculus that like actually what we want to do is show that every candidate should try and build and find black support, as opposed to having the black candidate who has that lane, right? And I think so much of what's interesting about the Jesse Jackson story is that no matter how much he tried to cast himself as not the black candidate in the black lane, the world just saw him that way for one reason or another, which says a lot about party politics and probably says a lot about why he was maybe not as successful as he was hoping to be. But why is it, this is sort of a naive question, but why is it that he is trying his hand at party politics, right? I mean, there's plenty of people who remain outsider activists who find lots of agency and success, changing the world in the way they want to change it. But why all of a sudden let's mount some presidential campaigns in 84 and 88?
My sense is that Jackson didn't think that the Democratic Party was moving in the right direction, that it didn't have a clear vision that was an alternative to Reaganism. I think he was concerned, and rightly so, that the party might start moving toward Ronald Reagan and more conservative policies, which it ultimately would do in the 1990s. And so by running for president, he was able to call attention to a platform and a vision for the Democratic Party that he wanted the party to move toward. And so he's one of those candidates, as we talked about in an earlier episode, who is running. I mean, he wants to be president, but he also wants to offer an alternative to what he's seeing in all these other candidates.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because Jesse Jackson is known for giving a good speech. He can rally the troops. And when he gives this speech in, I think it's May of 1983, before like 4,000 ministers, and he's sort of bemoaning the fact that we have not had significant representation within the House of Representatives, within, Congress, not since Reconstruction have we had, elected officials in a meaningful way. And so as he's giving the speech, people are basically saying to him, well, run. Why don't you run? How about you put your name on the ballot? And he sort of uses that momentum as an opportunity to do that. But it's interesting, though, because he doesn't run for mayor of Chicago or U.S. It's president. Let's just start with the president.
Right.
Well, I also think he had kind of a theory of the case that's worth talking about, because he was looking around at the 1980 election and saw that Reagan had won Massachusetts by 2,500 votes. Well, he pointed to the unregistered people in Massachusetts, 100,000 students unregistered, over 50,000 black people, 50,000 Latinos. And he's just like, why don't we mobilize these people? And if the Democratic Party wasn't going to do it, he wanted to be the person in the Democratic Party who was making that happen. And voter registration becomes a huge part of his 1984 run.
And, I am fascinated by some of the language that he uses as he's starting to get into primary politics. And, Kellie pointed out some of these big speeches he gives in 83 as he's gearing up for the 84 election, and he says stuff like, it's about time we forgot about black and white and started talking about employed and unemployed. And, much of his, and this is going back to what you pointed out, that he's really focused on economic issues. Some of this, in a way, kind of reminds me of the line Barack Obama was trying to walk in 2007, heading into the 2008 election, and I think got a lot of criticism from black voters and black activists saying you're not talking explicitly about race. And his reaction was basically, if I solve economic issues, that is the best way to help the black community, which I think was both. I mean, Niki probably knows better than I do, but which was, I think, both a kind of real core belief, but also an attempt at triangulation of I can't actually go out there and talk about I want to help black voters explicitly. And of course, then he's has to give a speech on race, which we've talked about on the show, is over. But, how much is Jesse Jackson thinking in that same mode of like a better economy for all is the best way to help my people, so to put it that way? Or how much is he also then saying, I can't go out there and explicitly talk about race because that's just not a viable path?
I think it depends on what room he's in and who he's talking to. Because when he is talking to African Americans, he clearly speaks in a way that is directly to them. But when he is speaking from a multicultural perspective, the Rainbow Push Coalition, that becomes his brainchild, his baby. He saw the power of what it meant to have solidarity among marginalized groups. So Black people, Latino, Jewish people, women. And he realized, okay, if I can galvanize all of these marginalized people, maybe together we're much more effective at accomplishing some of these goals than if we try to push it solely as a racial issue.
Do you ever feel like there's nothing new in the news? There are urgent things happening in the world around you, but all you hear is noise. That's why we made What Next? Our goal is to tell you the stories you haven't heard before, or maybe a different side to the story you thought you already knew all about. I'm Mary Harris, the host of What Next, and I love my job because it helps me cut through the noise of the news. And then I get to bring it to you. Together, we can figure out what next.
Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
And it's this cool kind of multicultural populism. That if we think about populism and the politics of populism in the U.S., it often skews to a very exclusionary, very white-only place. And here he has those populist economic policies that is fully inclusive. And it is just, again, this vision of what would it be like if we could unite all of these people, including poor whites and Black people and young people, in one coalition, and everyone gets better because the policies are helping everyone in this coalition. And it's that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it inclusionary or enlightened populism, but it is a reminder that there's a kind of populism out there that isn't just revanchist and reactionary.
I mean, he calls, his coalition is called the Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah, it's the really, Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah, which is a very sort of 1980s kind of vibe. But no, I mean, it's true. It seems like over and over in terms of branding, at the very least, and then I think certainly in terms of policy and depending on what room he's talking to, he really is trying to, push in this more populist, inclusive direction. And I think, as I said, one of the fascinating things, and part of this is because he really has some real, faults and some weaknesses, but part of it is that no matter how much he tries to do that, he is still seen as the Black candidate, and in some circles as the radical Black candidate. I think people of a certain age, I think they have a vision of Jesse Jackson, and it's like, oh yeah, he was this civil rights leader who tried his hand at democratic politics, and it's like, no, he was doing everything he could to get people to try and see him as more than that, and it didn't really work, which I think says a lot. But it also, as I said, there's an element there of him having some real weaknesses, and we have to mention that in the 1984 election he gets in hot water for some pretty awful remarks about Jewish Americans, and he talks about Jews in New York City and uses some ethnic slurs, and he has to apologize for that. There's also this big question of his association with Louis Farrakhan, and certainly that, I think Farrakhan was one of the big boogeymen in the 1980s, and so he has to navigate that. So do you have thoughts about him as just a candidate and those quote unquote weaknesses, or kind of where he starts to then fade behind, and eventually obviously Mondale gets the nomination?
Well, I think part of it is that Jackson was really running an insurgent candidacy, and those insurgent candidacies tend to get tripped up on, just coming from different experiences and different backgrounds. We've talked about the rise of the celebrity candidate who comes straight from television to the presidency. And in the case of Jackson, he hadn't held elected office before. He was making the leap right from activism to an electoral run. So he was used to having a national platform, but he was speaking to probably a set of different audiences than he had spoken to before. It is also the case, and we can talk a little bit about his 88 run later, but the 84 run, the idea that a Black candidate could win a state in a primary was something that had never been done before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the vision of what was even possible when Jackson is making this run is, we just have to remember that there was no precedent for this. Shirley Chisholm had run in 1972, but she hadn't won any states. And so Jackson is, he's not going to get that close. He finishes in third place. He does get 18 or 19% of the primary vote.
Yeah.
But he breaks a lot of barriers along the way.
I was going to say, not bad for someone who a lot of people did not expect him to do very well or go very far. I think that when we saw Shirley Chisholm's run, as you mentioned, we saw it as a symbolic run more than something that would be possible. And I think that, there's a lot of people that made the argument that Jesse Jackson makes Obama's run possible in the sense that people could envision someone actually going the distance.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, as we're in this hangers-on week, I think you just sort of laid out a nice little lesson that we're seeing in the sort of stages of how certain types of candidates soften the ground, right? And so you have Chisholm as the symbolic, to put lack of a better word, and then you have Jackson as the not viable but still legit, and then you eventually get to a place where they've actually proven some things and people can pick up that mantle. Let's quickly turn to 88, and I think he tries his hand again, and I think if most people have a vision of Jesse Jackson as a Democratic primary candidate, it is that speech he gives in 1988 at the convention, which we have done a specific episode on. But is his role in the party different going into 1988 as a now person who tried his hand once and didn't break through?
He could have turned into one of those perennial candidates who just keeps running, like a Ron Paul kind of figure. But he actually does really well in the 1988 campaign. He comes in second. He's winning a ton more. I think he wins 13 states or something in that ballpark. He is a viable candidate in 1988. And that's part of the reason why he gets such a platform at the 1988 convention, because he's still putting forward this vision for the Democratic Party and what it could be, that, the Democratic Party is going to roundly reject 4 years later. But it is, I don't know, it feels like these campaigns where candidates come back, and it's not their first one, so it doesn't feel groundbreaking in the same way, but they show greater viability. I feel like the 88 campaign is important for that.
I think what's interesting about the 88 candidacy is that in some ways, Jesse Jackson is sort of still seen as a third party candidate, even though he's running under a Democratic ticket. People don't really, they see him as the alternative, but they don't necessarily see him as the key candidate that's going to win and take it all the way. And I think he gets trapped in that third candidate sort of praxis, because that's how a lot of Americans view these people that are oh, they're inspirational. Oh, they're saying things that the other two candidates aren't saying. Oh, they're putting out ideas that are maybe a little bit more radical or a little bit more fringe. And that draws people in, but it's never enough to sort of push someone over into the mainstream. And I think that's where Jesse Jackson sort of gets trapped in that third wheel.
Well, I mean, it does make me think of Bernie Sanders,
I was just about to say that.
I mean, right? I mean, he runs in 2016, and I think similar to the 84 election, he's carved out a progressive lane and he doesn't get the nomination, and then the more establishment candidate loses, and I think it galvanizes the left wing of the party to say, look, that was where the energy in this party is. And then you go into the following election and he still doesn't win, but now look at that mainstream candidate. That mainstream candidate has had to reckon with that more, that's what Biden had to do in 2020. He really had to be pulled to the left. And I think it's because of Sanders, even though Sanders, of course, was still there and still the person's like, if you want Sanders' policy, Sanders is sitting right there. But, it is this interesting dynamic, and it does feel like Jackson is playing a similar role there. I guess if we're mentioning Biden, we should mention he is kicking around in all of this, and he has a very interesting relationship with we should say Jackson comes in second, as you pointed out, in 88. He beats out Biden, Al Gore, Dick Gephardt, a lot of people who would continue to be real stalwarts in the Democratic Party. He ends up losing, of course, coming second to Dukakis. But I think, Niki, your point, it's a very viable campaign in 88.
It is a viable campaign. And it's funny because Jackson gets attacked for sort of engaging in class warfare, which is so funny because I think that today there is this real sense in people who talk about mainstream politics where it's like class versus identity. And one of the amazing things about the Jackson campaign is he's like, no, it's both. We need to remove these barriers for discrimination. We need to register all of these voters. And we also need to address all of these issues of poverty and class inequality, and was bringing them together. And to hear him attacked as like a class warfare candidate, given how he would be attacked today, is pretty interesting.
To say the least.
Well, he also gets attacked as a sort of race warfare candidate, right? I mean, like Biden says, and I think this is largely seen as a veiled dig at Jackson, but he says, we want to reject the voices in the movement who tell Black Americans to go it alone, which is just a sort of willful misreading, I think, of what Jackson was really trying to do, which was the Rainbow Coalition. And so, it's interesting to hear Biden say that. All right. I think to just kind of take half a step back and paint a picture of this Hangers-On Week that we're doing here, because I think this will also be a thread we pick up going into the next and final episode in our series. But it does feel like one of the things we're learning is that a lot of these candidates who stick around, one of the things they do, whether it's intentional or not, is they point out a new coalition for a party establishment. And they force a party to not just reckon with the policies, but just the pockets of voters and the kinds of voters who they could pull together. And I would say, I've become convinced, I think next episode we'll talk about this even more, but I've become convinced that is a real role for the hanger-on. All right, well, let's leave it there because we do have one more episode in Hangers-On Week. So we will wrap this up, but we'll be back next episode and we'll go further back in history. With our final episode of Hanger-On Week, we'll go into the 1920s and 30s and talk about a serial candidate in the Democratic Party then. But for now, I'll say Nicole Hemmer, thanks as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We pause and give praise and honor to God for being good enough to allow us to be at this place at this time. When I look out at this convention, I see the face of America, red, yellow, brown, black, and white. We're all precious in God's sight, the real Rainbow Coalition. All of us.
Radiotopia from PRX.